Welcome to Betrayal Trauma Recovery, BTR.org. I'm Anne. We've opened up some new group session times that work for Australians and also for women in the UK. Go to btr.org/group to see if the group sessions will work for you. I'm sure you remember what it was like when you were searching for help, maybe for your husband, hoping to find the right program or therapist. That's why I started podcasting, because I supported my husband through 7 years of pornography addiction recovery, and not one therapist during that time told me I was experiencing emotional and psychological abuse and sexual coercion. I didn't want any other woman on the planet to be in the dark. If you're like the majority of my listeners, you're experiencing the type of abuse that's invisible and difficult to wrap your head around. Your husband is lying to you, using porn or having affairs or some other type of emotional and psychological abuse, and you're getting the same bad advice about how to improve communication or your relationship. If you need support from women who totally understand, our coaches can help you sort through this. We'd love to see you in a group session today. If this podcast is helpful to you and you wish you'd found it sooner, one simple anonymous way to help spread the word is to click follow or subscribe on the Betrayal Trauma Recovery podcast. Every 5-star rating helps make this podcast more visible and will help save other women from getting the wrong kind of help, like a couple program that will make this type of abuse worse. Your support means I can continue sharing this life-changing information with women throughout the world for free. Scroll to the bottom of any page on btr.org and click on Support the Podcast. Thank you. I couldn't do this without you. I've invited Dave Cawley, an investigative journalist and host of the Cold podcast, back on today's episode. We have already talked about season 1 of the Cold podcast, which we re-aired last week. That episode is called Signs Your Husband Might Kill You. It's important for every woman who's experiencing emotional and psychological abuse to be able to recognize it, because physical abuse never happens in a vacuum. Dave and I are going to talk as if you've heard all of the Cold podcast, seasons 1, 2, and 3. And if you haven't, don't worry, you'll still really benefit from listening to our analysis as we discuss the themes of all 3 seasons. Welcome, Dave.
Thank you so much, Anne. I appreciate being with you.
So the 3 seasons of the Cold podcast, Dave, you cover in season 1, the murder of Susan Powell, in season 2, the murder of Joyce Yost, and in season 3, the murder of Sheree Warren. And you start season 3 by introducing us to a man named Carrie Hartman. And you describe his abusive behavior toward women in the form of what some people might call prank phone calls. Law enforcement called it an obscene phone call. Really, these phone calls were abusive to the women who received them, even if the women didn't realize it and even if they were not defined that way. Can you talk about why these abusive phone calls define Carrie's character?
Sheree Warren disappears in October of 1985. She was dating this man, Carrie Hartman, at the time. And at first, Carrie Hartman is not on the radar of the investigators. It's not until a year and a half later, when Carrie Hartman is identified as a suspect in a series of home invasion sexual assaults, where he's literally breaking into women's homes and attacking them, raping them. And so I actually end up starting this story way before we ever meet Sheree, with Carrie Hartman's first arrest in 1971, where he makes one of these calls. He tells this woman basically a threat that if he doesn't get what he wants, she's going to be harmed. And to your point, Anne, she was a victim. She was abused, right?
Yeah. At the time you interviewed her, did she recognize that she was a victim of his abuse? Or did she just think like, oh, a criminal called me and I helped the police identify this guy?
At this point in her life, she was, I want to say, about 86 years old when I interviewed her. Heidi Posning, she's an amazing woman, but her life experience was so different. I mean, she literally survived Berlin at the end of World War II as a child. And so her perception of like how much risk she may or may not have been in at the time, I think is different than you or I in the same situation. And I think many people who are victims of abuse, she doesn't like thinking about it or talking about it. Sitting down and interviewing her about it, even all these years later, it was clear it brought up bad memories. It brought up emotions that she was uncomfortable with. You do this kind of thing every day, Anne, talking to people who have been through abuse. You know how difficult those conversations are. And I was very grateful that Heidi was willing to take us there for the story, because it does allow for the listener to begin seeing the bigger picture. Like, what are the systemic things that are taking place in our society that are causing these kinds of things to be brushed off? It's a minor crime. It's voyeurism. It's telephone harassment. It's nothing serious.
Yeah, he has all of these abusive episodes, but they're not defined that way by law enforcement. There's a difference between obscene phone call, which is what they had written on their documents, right? And an abusive phone call. Like when people say something like 1 out of every 4 women are domestic abuse victims in the state of Utah. They're not saying 1 out of every 4 women is abused by a man in the state of Utah.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I think on the part of the investigators at the time, the thought is, we caught him. He's going to be shamed. He's going to change his ways. And if you have that perspective in law enforcement, you've got to step back and look at it and say, pattern-wise, like, what is happening here? And with Carrie Hartman, we know these phone calls escalated over time. He ends up calling thousands of women in a harassing way, where he would try to get women to talk about their bodies, their clothing, in a way that titillated him. It's still today thousands of victims who will never receive any measure of justice. And a lot of them probably brush it off and, I just hung up on the guy. And I think there is definitely a need to, at least from the perspective of a journalist, think about how we talk about those kinds of situations, because we have to be objective. We have to be as unbiased as we possibly can. But I think there's also room for journalists to call a spade a spade. These are the actions that Carrie Hartman was taking. And you're right, they are abusive. Let's just call it what it is.
Yeah, I'm reminded of an interview that I did with a man who spent, I think, 10 years in prison for sexual abuse. And he considered himself a sex addict. And he was like, I was acting out in my sex addiction, is how he described it. And I said, well, there's another word for that. It's that you were an abuser. And he was like, oh, I never thought about it like that.
The focus on himself rather than on the person he was harming.
Yeah. If he's an abuser, he hurt someone else rather than he is a sex addict. He just acted out in his addiction.
Right. That's a really good point. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, part of the process for somebody who goes to prison for this kind of crime, if they're going to ever be paroled, is usually that they have to go through some kind of a therapy or a treatment program. The DSM, tailored for mental health professionals who are trying to diagnose people.
It's not about their victim, because they're like, maybe we can get him to stop having this
paraphilic disorder. Yeah.
There we go. Maybe we can get him to stop doing that, rather than maybe we should figure out how to protect other people from this person. And at least from all of the victims that I have interviewed, it has not worked. Like, in fact, the domestic violence shelter will tell you that most of the time an abuser rehabilitation class, for example, makes them worse.
There's an argument that in some ways it might teach them to just be better about hiding it.
Exactly. And a lot of them come out and start accusing their victim of being an abuser. And then it gets very confusing.
They learn all the language. They learn the terminology. Sure.
Exactly.
As far as the Sheree Warren case with Carrie Hartman, as long as we're talking about treatment, I mean, I think an interesting thing to note, Carrie Hartman ends up going to prison for 33 years in these rape cases. And during that time, as we were just talking about, he is required repeatedly to go through sex offender therapy. He has to pass that as a condition of being released on parole. Carrie Hartman was released on parole in March of 2020. He got out of prison, and during the next 4 years was living in our community here in the state of Utah, where I live and work, and was recently returned to prison because it was discovered that he had been stalking a woman, according to the Utah Board of Pardons and Parole, while he was out. And so you have to stop and say, wait a minute, did those 30 plus years in prison, did those repeat trips through sex offender therapy, did they help Carrie Hartman not harm people while back out in society? And it appears the answer to that question is no. So I want to hope that those systems can work, but in this case specifically, it sure seems like it did not.
And me listening to that, at least the way that you laid out the facts, the conclusion that I came to as a abuse expert was that he was just figuring out what the parole board wanted to hear. He went to sex offender therapy eventually and then learned the words that he needed to say and was able to parrot that back to the parole board to their satisfaction in order to be paroled. I was so grateful that they kept him in prison for so long because they absolutely could have let him out sooner. So that was a good part of the story, I thought.
Yeah. In conversations that I had with law enforcement, people who investigated that case, or in the legal profession who tried that case in court, that came up repeatedly. They said, look, in a homicide, or let's say a manslaughter, somebody who kills another person, they might do 10 years and get out. The fact that Carrie Hartman was in for more than 30 years on rape was a big deal. And the reason he was in so long is because he refused to accept responsibility. And like you said, as a listener, I think it's a fair takeaway to listen to all of those years of him going before the parole board and just slowly creeping forward the little bit of accountability that he would take until he reached that sweet spot where they said, okay, that's enough, we'll let you out.
Carrie Hartman is a scary guy, but how much scarier would he have been had he learned faster? Let's say he'd gone to sex offender therapy sooner and taken accountability sooner and sounded better sooner. He could have been let out sooner. The scariest ones to me are the ones who know that's what they need to sound like. In terms of my listeners' husbands, that's what they sound like in couple therapy, or they might sound like that to clergy. And clergy might be like, yes, he's repented. How do I help my listeners see, is this someone who is now safe, or are you currently in danger? At the very least, in danger of being emotionally and psychologically abused, in danger of an STD, in danger of being lied to is a concern when this is the person that you're supposed to trust.
So if I can segue off of that, in season 1 of Cold, when we talked about the case of Josh and Susan Powell, so this is a married couple. They've got 2 young sons, and there's this extreme strife going on in their marriage. Susan is upset that Josh is controlling of the money. He's controlling of her ability to spend time with friends and family. And she tries to drag him into therapy. She tries to drag him in front of clergy. And we actually have evidence from writings that Susan left behind after she was killed, where she talks about Josh says, if I call the police, if I call 911 and say that he's threatening me, when the police get here, he's going to be calm and I'm going to be hysterical and he'll make me out to be the one who's irrational. She was conscious of these very things. And then moving forward, when we entered season 2 in Cold, and there's this story about Joyce Yost being murdered by this man, Doug Lovell. Doug Lovell goes to prison. He's still in prison. He's been sentenced to death twice. He's had his death sentence overturned twice. And part of the reason is because since he went to prison, he has built relationships with members of clergy, people who go to the prison to work with inmates to help them hopefully become better people, prepare them to be released. Doug Lovell is not going to be released. He is, as I said, serving a death sentence or is in kind of limbo while they figure out whether his death sentence is going to go forward. But those relationships and the way he talks to clergy have allowed him to essentially create a group of supporters who, when he goes to court, when he goes to trial, are willing to stand up in front of a judge or stand up in front of a jury and say, I believe Doug Lovell is a man with a good heart. I believe he's a man who's changed. I believe he's a man who deserves a second chance. What we know is Doug Lovell murdered Joyce Yost and has refused to return her body.
Right. Flat out manipulation Doug Lovell used to convince some people that he has a quote unquote good heart. The evidence would be that he tells people exactly where that body is, which he has not done.
Right. That's how you show true remorse, in my mind.
In our community, we actually call this meatloafing. It's from the Meatloaf song, I would do anything for love, but I won't do that.
Yes. This is really interesting, and it gets into the weeds of the court case. Lovell, there's no question that he was responsible. He did admit to it, but that was part of a plea deal back in 1993 where he was trying to get a chance for life with parole. At the time, Utah did not have a law that allowed life without parole. So the choice was life with parole or the death sentence. And he thought, if I admit to it, there's this plea deal on the table and I will have a chance of getting out of prison. Before the case actually went to sentencing, though, the law changed and the prosecutors pulled life with parole off the table. And at that point, Lovell said, I don't want to plead guilty anymore. And this is part of why that case ended up going through appeal after appeal. The death sentence ended up being rescinded because the appeals courts determined that Lovell was not appropriately advised of the rights he was giving up. So he goes back to trial in 2015. The problem is he's admitted on the record that he killed Joyce Yost. So that fact is not in dispute. How do you go in front of a jury and say, yes, I killed this person, but, and that's where these religious leaders came in. They went before the court and said, in all those years, Lovell is a changed man.
Listening to the manipulative letters that Doug Lovell sent those religious leaders was surreal because they sound almost exactly like the manipulative letters that so many of the victims that I talk to receive. In fact, I've actually created a workshop to show women the patterns of these types of manipulative letters. It's in my message workshop. So listeners, if you want to learn more about that, it's btr.org/message, where I show women like how it's abusive and then how to respond. In terms of Doug Lovell, it was very unnerving to hear that these religious leaders fell for this type of manipulation. In fact, judges fall for this type of manipulation too. There are cases that I know of in Utah where the abusive man is in jail, but he's writing manipulative and abusive letters to his kids, and the victim is court ordered to show these manipulative, abusive letters to her own children, which, to talk about Susan Powell again, I mean, she was killed, but Josh Powell, her murderer, still had parental rights.
Yeah. So let me set the table for that a little bit. Josh Powell, after his wife, quote unquote, disappears in 2009, within a couple of weeks, he takes his two sons, Charlie and Braden, with him, leaves the state of Utah, goes to Washington State, and he is living under his father's roof. A few things happen there. The West Valley City Police Department, they have a circumstantial case that Josh murdered his wife, and that's getting stronger as time goes forward. What they don't have is direct physical evidence, like a body, linking Josh to Susan's death. And so in the absence of that, the prosecutors would not give police an arrest warrant. The police are aware that these two boys are potentially at risk. Early in the investigation, a detective from Utah contacts the Child Protective Services Agency in Washington and says, can you intervene in any way? And the state of Washington tells the West Valley City Police Department, unless there's an allegation of like ongoing or immediate abuse happening, that's not our job.
I mean, the likelihood that he killed his wife is like 100%. So he's a murderer, but he's an appropriate caregiver for children.
Right. Unless he's charged and arrested, they don't intervene, was the position at the time.
This like letter of the law thing. And then there's like, how do we actually protect people? I mean, someone who kills their wife is an abuser, but they're not defining him as an abuser.
And this was the insidiousness of Josh Powell. Josh Powell was very good at cloaking abuse in a way that it didn't look from the outside as abuse, right? I think you and I rationally can sit back and say the act of murdering his children's mother is abuse of those children. Until the police can prove it, the Child Protective Services workers in Washington, they weren't going to do anything about it. And so the investigation for her murder is taking place mostly here in Utah, but there's an aspect that's taking place in Washington. And it culminates in the latter part of 2011, because there's a big police operation that we learn about in Cold Season 1 called Operation Tsunami. And part of this whole investigation is the service of a search warrant at Josh's dad's house in Washington. When police go in there searching, they discover that Steve Powell had been obsessed sexually with his daughter-in-law, Susan. And they find all kinds of voyeur materials focused on Susan and other women. Steve Powell had been recording women without their knowledge. And among those were 2 neighbor girls who were underage. And under the definition of the law, this is treated as child pornography. So 2 crimes, voyeurism, child pornography. Steve Powell is arrested. At that time, the state of Washington says, wait a minute, these 2 boys, Charlie and Braden, they were in that house. This is an unsafe environment for those children. So they come in and they take temporary protective custody of Charlie and Braden. So it really took the investigation moving forward to that point where there was a catalyst. There was an event that took place with the discovery of those voyeuristic child pornography materials that triggered the state of Washington to take action. But once those boys were in temporary protective custody, that didn't mean they were going to stay there. Josh immediately starts a campaign trying to get custody of his kids back. And he was actually within a step or 2 of clearing every hurdle that the court put in front of him, and was probably going to get custody of his children back. And then police in Utah, who were under a court seal, they couldn't talk about the case publicly, even to other police agencies. They get permission from a judge to share some evidence with the state of Washington family court. They send this information up, and it's troubling enough that the judge in Washington says, before we give Josh Powell custody of his children, we are going to require that he undergo a psychosexual evaluation. So they're going to do a very invasive psychological evaluation, looking into, is there anything happening with Josh in his mind that would put the kids in danger? Now, during this period of time, the court was allowing Josh to have visits with the children. At first, it was required that be done in a neutral third-party secure environment. But over time, he convinces the court that he's safe, that they can allow his kids to come visit him at a home that he had rented. And the judge did not revisit that idea after this major change, right? Requiring Josh to go through this invasive psychological evaluation. And within a matter of days, during a court-authorized, quote-unquote, supervised visit, we know that Josh locks the supervised visitation coordinator out of the house. He murders his 2 sons. Horrific ending to this entire investigation. What about Susan's parents? What could they do in the aftermath of that horrible event? They sued the state of Washington, the agency. They sued the individual social workers who were involved. And that case wound through the courts for a long time. I mean, it was more than 10 years before it got resolved. The individual social workers were deemed immune because they were state employees and working on behalf of the state in that capacity. They couldn't be held individually liable, but the agency could. Susan's parents ended up taking that case to trial. So a jury in Pierce County, Washington, hears weeks and weeks of testimony about all the details of the ins and outs of this back and forth with the criminal investigation, with the family court in the state of Washington. Long story short, they end up giving a verdict, and they say the state of Washington was negligent in allowing the children to be in Josh Powell's custody while he was going through this process. And they awarded Susan's parents $100 million, give or take, in damages. Of course, nothing that helps them bring the kids back. But their hope was that it would inspire some kind of change. Part of the reason that we know as much as we do about what happened in the state of Washington behind the scenes is the law there required there be an inquest when Charlie and Braden were murdered back in 2012. And the law also required that the results of that inquest be made public. Transparency is one part of it, but the action to say, okay, these are the things that failed, let's fix those, is the next. And I think that's where often we see agencies, individuals drop the ball. They can acknowledge that, yes, a child being murdered is a bad outcome. But what are you going to do about it? That's where we often fall flat.
Just recently, within the last couple of months, there's a victim. Her perpetrator has 27 protective order violations. This is in the state of Utah right now. So she reported one of these violations in Salt Lake City, and they didn't do anything about it. So the department over that heard about it somehow and gave her a call. Now, this is a victim who's been working with the domestic violence shelter, Safe Harbor, for more than 3 years, and she can't even get divorced from this guy. They're still in custody court. But the department that oversees things, they interviewed her and did a lethality assessment. They called her back like a week later and said, we have the findings for you. You're a really high risk. Holy cow, this is really bad. And the conclusion that we've come to is you need services from the domestic violence shelter.
That's it?
And she's like, what? I've already been going to Safe Harbor for 3 years. That's the state of domestic violence services. It's like going around in circles. There's how it's supposed to work, and then there's how it's actually working. A lot of victims will tell you that when they tell other people that the system isn't protecting them, people generally assume you must have done something wrong, like maybe you didn't fill out the right form, not realizing you can do everything right and still not get the help that you need. And that's such a fine line for me as an educator. We need to give women hope that they can move toward a better life, but also be aware of all of the obstacles that they might face.
And I think about this a lot because from my perspective as a journalist telling these stories, part of the reason to do it is to educate. But there's a parasocial relationship between myself and a listener. Somebody listens to me for hours on end talking about these cases. And I've had the experience many times of somebody who's listening going, oh my gosh, what he's talking about, like this story, this is my life. And reach out to me. And in many cases, they're asking for just somebody to hear them. But other times they're more specific, like, help me. You seem like an expert. You seem to know what's going on. What do I do in this situation? And I feel so ill-equipped. I want to help. So I'll try to connect them with domestic violence resources. And I have to ask myself, did I actually help that person? It's so hard.
Yeah. Here at BTR, we have group sessions and individual sessions, workshops for women to learn safety strategies, whether they're married or not. I mean, it's my mission to make sure that they actually get the help that they need. Speaking of abusive partners, in both season 1 and season 3 of the Cold podcast, an abusive partner plays a role. Season 1 is Josh Powell, and in season 3, Chuck Warren is an abuser. He's married to Sheree Warren. I can say that because I can see the markers and the things that you reported. He is also a suspect. And in every single season, every single perpetrator, and Chuck Warren as well, has a history or patterns of objectifying women, using pornography, prostitution. With Carrie Hartman, there's tons of evidence of the obscene phone calls and rape. Like, what was going on in the 80s in Ogden, by the way? Like, that's wild. I was like, holy cow. I mean, it's season 3. There are 3 serial rapists in Ogden. Anyway, all the guys in seasons 1, 2, and 3 show a pattern of objectifying women. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, all of them are different in their own ways. Josh, when I started looking into his background, his youth, and his relationship with Susan, there are a lot of indicators that Josh was in many ways, I don't want to say asexual, but Susan, his wife, would write about this. He wouldn't hold her hand. He wouldn't kiss her. He would always find an excuse. I'm going to get sick. So he had something going on, right? And the problem with Josh is the evidence that I talked about earlier that got sent to Washington State in the child custody proceeding was found on a computer in the Powell home, and the belief of the investigators at the time was that it was pornography belonging to Josh. What we do know is Josh Powell's father was absolutely sexually deviant in his views toward women generally and to Susan specifically. And there was a dynamic back and forth between Josh and his dad. Josh was aware of his father's inappropriate advances on Susan, his wife, and he did nothing to stop it.
A lack of sexual interest in your partner definitely is just a characteristic of excessive porn use, because they're masturbating all the time and they're not into sex with a real person, right? So even though that is a marker, in Josh's case, there was no evidence
directly for him. But you can understand why the police would believe it, given what you said, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Season 2 and season 3 both take place in Ogden, Utah in 1985. And it is fascinating to me that Doug Lovell, who first raped and then murdered Joyce Yost, is operating at the same time Carrie Hartman, we know, is attacking women. And you've got Sheree divorcing Chuck Warren at the time, in a lot of ways very similar to Susan Powell, right? There's a custody issue going on. Chuck Warren, we later find out, was soliciting prostitutes, sex workers, who are also victims, right? And did Sheree know about that? Probably not. So he's lying to her, presumably, which is a form of abuse. There was a lot of that kind of dynamic going on. And part of the reason with Sheree's case in particular that I wanted to focus on that is in the immediate aftermath of Sheree's disappearance, the first days, weeks, months, her estranged husband, Chuck Warren, he looks like Josh Powell. He looks like a really strong suspect. He's not being forthcoming. There are, stories about him having done a pretty horrific act of physical abuse against his first wife. Sheree is his second wife. You can understand why law enforcement is looking at Chuck. Holy cow, this looks like all those abuse markers. And it's the same story we've seen. And then all of a sudden, Carrie Hartman comes into orbit over here. And you realize that Sheree had this unlucky confluence of bad men in her life. Had Chuck Warren been a more stand-up guy, had he been a better husband, I think the investigation would have more quickly focused on Carrie and some of the steps that I believe or suspect that Carrie took to potentially obscure his activities around the time that Sheree disappeared. They would have been looked at much sooner than 15 years later, as we see happen. I'm not somebody who likes to stand up on a soapbox and say every man is a bad person.
Right. Me either.
But I also like to stand up and say, guys, we got to do better than this. Even if you are not harming your wife, your partner, you probably know somebody who is. You talked about those statistics, the 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 women who will experience domestic violence in their lives. If I can turn that around from like a man's perspective, how many of the guys that I would consider friends are at home behind closed doors doing those kinds of things? And what behaviors am I maybe seeing but choosing not to react to? Or am I just putting those blinders? Like, we all have a role in seeing it for what it is, calling it what it is, and standing up to it.
Dave, thank you so much for all of your hard work to bring these really important stories to light.
You've been a supporter and a booster, if I can say that, for a long time. That's not lost on me. You're doing the work in the trenches. I mean what I say when I talk about how hard that is. And I just hope for your sake that you find ways to cleanse yourself of it, from time to time, because it's so hard. So thank you for the work that you do and all of the women that you've helped, honestly. This kind of work does take a toll on you. And while I feel a strong obligation to continue building on the work that has been done in these 3 seasons of this Cold podcast, I also need to watch out for my own emotional and mental health. I'm hopeful we can, again, as you say, help educate people so that we don't have to keep telling these kinds of stories.
If this podcast is helpful to you, please help us reach other women by following or subscribing and giving us a 5-star rating. Thank you for helping other women find us. If you've already purchased a copy of my book, Trauma Mama, Husband Drama, please circle back and give it a 5-star rating. A lot of women are searching for books about betrayal trauma on Amazon, and rating Trauma Mama will help them find this podcast, which is free to everyone. Your donations keep this podcast going. Go to our website, btr.org, scroll to the bottom, click on Support the BTR Podcast. And until next week, stay safe out there.